For everyone who's on the call, hey, I'm Will, and I'll be host today. So this afternoon, we're joined by 4 sensational speakers. We've got a mix of leading VCs and the UK's industry fintech body. So we have, excuse me, guests, I'll just quickly do the round robin so everyone knows who's doing the Zoom. We've got Mina from Dawn Capital, Jay from Albion VC, Yusuf from QED Investors, and Caroline from Innovate Finance. We'll also be inviting our audience members on stage to put questions that you directly have to the panel. So if anyone's got a burning question, drop it into the comments and we'll invite you on up, providing it's street legal. So we're 11 weeks into lockdown and we've seen some pretty major acquisitions across open banking, lending, payments. Some firms have been getting funded and others have incredibly sadly been furloughed. 2020 has been a real roller coaster, but as an optimist and with lockdown easing, pubs possibly opening and new formats like this springing up, it feels like there could be light at the end of the tunnel. So today with our guests, we'll be talking through what's happened over the last nearly 3 months now, what's working for investors and what's working for fintech more broadly in the community. And of course, we'll try and peer through the foggy future to see what we think is coming next. All right, so starting off with a bit of a pulse check. Where are we now? Mina, I'd love to get your 2 cents on the evolving mindsets that you've seen companies, founders, investors all going through during these first rocky few months.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So it's definitely been a roller coaster, but I think reflecting back on the last 3 months, it's probably 3 phases that at least we at Dawn went through and kind of hand in hand with our founders. I think it's fair to say sort of end of February, beginning of March was when it was just all eyes on the portfolio, kind of 3-4 weeks really working with our portfolio companies, working out who is where, who needs cash, how are they positioned. So luckily we only invest in B2B tech and SaaS, so we were quite protected in some ways from the worst parts of what COVID brought for some businesses. But you know, it was very clear that our businesses would also have to adjust and pivot. And the way we thought about it after, you know, the initial sort of cash is king, are you guys fine? Yes, you're fine. We don't need to fund you or worry about you. Is we went through a fairly structured process with them of thinking through your product. Is it something that, you know, is very urgent, like a Zoom or a Hopin? That's really replacing something that people just need to keep doing. Are you seeing a massive surge in demand? And we had a couple of businesses that really experienced that, just especially in cybersecurity and in some of the capital markets infrastructure that we've invested in. Or are you more like, I don't know, a massive data governance project that needs to be implemented? And frankly, that's not urgent. Nobody's going to be thinking about, you know, changing their CRM system right now in the middle of all this. And then on the other hand, what's your value proposition? Are you really ROI focused, or are you more kind of efficiency, soft, maybe customer satisfaction type metrics? And we very early took on the view that we're headed to a recession no matter what happens with the sort of medical side of COVID. So we know that in recession, very clear ROI businesses win. So it was very much figuring out, where are you today? How can you make your message more ROI focused? And in the urgency, are there actually parts of your product that you could highlight more than you did in the past? Or is it just, you know, people will wait and see, so maybe cut back on marketing, don't go so aggressive? So that was the first phase where we spent maybe the first month like working through that and getting that right with the companies. And then we sort of emerged from that, and it's kind of forgotten now, but I think this was the sort of highest uncertainty in the market where like the whole thing was heading over to the US. We really didn't know what was going to happen to capital markets. And then we looked around and we saw, hey, our pipeline's not really there because we haven't focused on it, but also everyone was just working out what's going to happen. So I think the second phase was, can we actually do deals now? Can we do deals remotely? Do we want to? So just working out really very clearly what's our investment appetite and where do we go and can we actually do it? And luckily, we can do it. So we announced our first ever fully remote deal last week, which was Brighter, which Evgenia, one of the partners here, co-led the Series A with Excel. So that was good. That was answered. There are companies out there raising and at very, very strong multiples with very, very strong competition going on for their rounds. And so that was good. And I think now that we're heading into this kind of half open, half closed world where you can meet people and some of you can meet, but some of you can't, and you can't really travel, but you can still see founders here in the UK very soon. It's just really working out, how are we going to, is this now the new normal, for how long? And while actually we feel like we're very much in full on mode, everyone's working very, very hard. There's a pipeline is very active. It's just kind of figuring out, is there going to be a more local focus now? How do we continue to bridge the gap when some people can actually meet? Like I cover Nordics, so I'm really annoyed because I can't go there, and I know that my competition have offices, in Copenhagen and Stockholm, and I've been meeting people throughout these last few months, so I can feel my social capital like depleting over there. But at the same time, I've spoken to a lot of my colleagues who can't make it back to the UK and cover fintech, and they're kind of, it's annoying. We need to be in the UK. This is where fintech is at. So I think it's just working out how this half open, half closed world works, and if that's and how you kind of continue to stay connected to people that you can't see immediately.
100%. And kudos for the first remote deal on the Dawn side. That's end-to-end awesome. Very nice.
Yeah, we're very pleased with that. Yeah.
So Caroline, obviously you have a very, very good view from, as the industry body. Government programs obviously been a huge lifeline to the economy and not just fintech, but how has the response evolved to support the community, specifically fintech?
I think the word evolved is important in this one, which is, and you're right, the government's done incredible things to support the wider economy. We've worked really closely, so we represent the sector at large, meaning we've got startups, we've got scale-up, so we're stage agnostic for sure. And we actually have really good relationships with the corporates because, as we know, money's coming from corporates as well, sometimes faster than before, given COVID, because they need to accelerate their digital strategy. We've been working really hard to ensure that the nuance of the fintech narrative is heard by government as they're crafting these ways to go to market to help support. So we saw kind of at the beginning of this phase, the CBILs, BIBLs, all of the schemes to help support wider business. And there are big parts of this, which is the financial services at large doesn't look like it did 10 years ago. And so there's nuances. I'll take alternative lending as an example, to how small businesses get loans. And it's really important to show just how much of a market share that segment of the market has today, because we did a good job of making sure that fintech was embedded into the wider lending process. So it's informing and having the industry feedback on those numbers. We saw yesterday the government actually put their numbers out on CBILs, on BIBLs, and on the future fund. I think the most recent work on future funds really interesting, trying to truly understand where growth capital is needed. So if it's not a company with revenue numbers that are traditional revenue numbers that you understand, how do you lend to them? What are the actual parameters for a term sheet that makes sense for the industry and are beneficial both to taxpayers but also to the community? I think the big piece here, it gets to the core of, as part of, meaning you mentioned it earlier, if you want to be in fintech, you have to be in the UK. The UK spent such a great effort building trust in consumers, building a full ecosystem. Ecosystem is the most overused word, but it's true. We've worked so hard. It seems a shame for cash flow to ruin some really good quality work that we've evolved. So it's been a matter of having that conversation across the industry, ensuring that we're representing the investor voice in this, the startup, scale up, high growth, ensuring that liquidity continues to go into the space. And I think Future Fund announced yesterday, so it has had 5.1 million pound request on the kind of within the first week, if I get my numbers. They've allocated 5.9 of that in convertible loans as of yet. It's open till September. So we hope that that helps inject some liquidity. I think we're going to talk later about this in this podcast about international money and what that effect will have on us, either the lack thereof or new parties that we're seeing come in. But I do think the government has done a really good job. They've been engaged on this. And as we said, it's different from the last crash because we have a whole new industry and there's nuances to that. So it's not just financial services that we're dealing with. FinTech has its own ways of working and just educating how much of a market there is here.
Yeah, that's particularly interesting around the future fund, how, you know, the businesses that truly need that growth capital rather than just, you know, they need cash flow to steady the boat. And Jay, putting the sort of your investment lens on, you know, what are the key trends or are there biases that you've seen over these last few months?
Yeah, so almost certainly there are. It just, you know, interesting. I just want to pick up on one point that Mina raised initially. It's really interesting. Just an anecdote. I was in a board meeting yesterday. I was in a board meeting this morning, and in both those board meetings, we didn't discuss COVID at all. The narrative of the board meetings was very forward looking. What should product strategy be? What should product marketing be? What should product messaging be? Really looking forward, not really reflecting on where we've been. And I think that's a, you know, we're living sort of week to week at the moment, but that's a marked change from a month ago, and I think signals a real structural shift in people's mindset as we now look forward. You asked me a question about sort of the investment lens. With the investment lens on, it's really interesting. We're starting to now get some quite meaningful data about investment activity throughout the COVID period, call it March to May, versus what we saw in Jan, Feb this year, and I'll talk to that later, and then versus what we saw of obviously the same period last year. And it's quite interesting to see some of the dynamics, both from a sector perspective, a business model, B2B, B2C perspective, and also investor behavior. So who's participating, in what shape, in what type of round structure, and we're getting some meaningful data on that. One of the really interesting parts of fintech is, you know, it's this amalgamation of two things, isn't it? It's financial services and technology. And, you know, personally, and I know a number of my peers, like we're still actually sifting through the underlying drivers of each of those things. We still don't know if we're going to go into an economic crisis yet. I mean, we're in a healthcare crisis, sure, right? But we haven't actually got to an economic crisis yet. We will probably get there because the unemployment data is suggesting that, right? And that will dictate a certain amount of what the underlying financial services models get funded, get underwritten. On the technology side, we're still sifting through those, right? As Mina said earlier, right? In some ways, you want to look for investments that are growing, not as a result of COVID, but in spite of COVID, probably is the best turn of phrase. But there's still a lot to work through in terms of what those look like today. So a few perspectives, but I'll speak to some of the data later on. It's quite interesting.
You're teasing us with that mention of data, right? So yeah, locking us in. And Yusuf, I mean, obviously there's been a huge amount of talk of pivots, and you know, some companies, you may have seen a company called Fronted, who really took the bull by the horns to help in that sort of area around the increasing the efficiency and the access to capital and financing. Yeah, what are the pivots that you've seen work, and what have been less effective?
Yeah, I mean, if you're if you're entering a crisis that's very volatile, very uncertain, things are changing by the day, by the week, kind of the ideal position you almost want to be in is as a small startup with a lean team and well-funded, right? And a lot of our portfolio companies or a lot of people in the ecosystem find themselves in this position. In fact, actually, this is not a bad place for a startup to be, and startups should be able to take advantage of this to a very great extent. But I think the question is very good because not everybody can take advantage of it to the same extent, and people have been impacted differently and have pivoted differently as a result of that. One pivot I've seen that did not work, which I think is very interesting, is if you had a model before the crisis, before COVID, that was working really well, and then this hits, and it just got turned upside down, which doesn't happen to everyone, but a fair percentage of our portfolio has had that happen. In that case, if you sort of just hunker down and just try to do a rope-a-dope and just wait for the crisis to pass, that is probably not the right strategy, even though it's a very understandable instinct on the part of founders. You may have cash in the bank that's going to last you even up to 2 years in some cases. And you just think, man, just got this to work. I just got product market fit. Now this happened. Let me just wait. Let me just cut as much as I can, hunker down. Well, as a startup, that is one thing that's not going to work. And thankfully, been working with our companies, and some of them that had sort of that tendency, which is maybe a minority, but still very understandable. We work with them, and they quickly pivoted into, actually, hold on. I'm a startup. I have money. I have a great team. I can take advantage of this and reinvent myself faster than anyone else can, and let me do that. And that's the pivot that we've really seen working. But it's a little bit, if you use a sort of surfing analogy, when you're on the top of the wave, you don't want to lean back. You don't want to lean forward too much. Or you definitely want to lean forward into it, otherwise you may fall, right? So it's that when it gets scary, it's just leaning into it, which is, I'll say, easier said than done, but having to do that, and that's what I think has worked really well. The other thing that's worked really well is doing what a startup does best, which is create products fast. So again, a lot of our companies had competitions organized where they said, let's have a competition. I was part of the panel of judges in some of these where we looked at if you have 60 people, teams of 3, 20 teams, compete for the best new product. In the circumstance, we judge it, and the top 3 products get rolled out with immediate effect. And we actually rolled out 3 products in 1 week in one instance. And we realized we'd done 1 product in 1 year before that, right? So I think those are some of the things that work really well for startups.
That's super cool. I like the idea of sort of a mini X Prize for each of the companies to fire off something and build new products. That's really interesting. So I guess then diving a little bit more into the investment side, and Jay, you've teased us enough about it, right? We're ready. Maybe you can help put an end to some of this rhetoric around funding being harder to access and the challenges created. Awaken my inner optimist. Turn that pessimist around. Tell us, is that the case? Are we seeing less activity, or is it just the pessimist stealing the narrative?
Well, it's a good question. It's the right question, and what's interesting now is we can start to hold data to some of the seductive narratives that we were all telling people, we were all telling ourselves that might happen, that could happen. So what does the data? Well, the data tell us, if you look at UK-based fintech businesses that are funded by institutional investors, there's some quite interesting pictures that emerge. So the first one is if you look at the funding activity cumulatively from January to May, you could conclude that nothing's happened. Actually, cumulatively, there's been more investment by value into somewhat fewer deals, but more investment by value than in this period, 2019. So you could conclude that it's looking good. However, obviously that's not what happened. I mean, all of that growth occurred in the 2 months pre-COVID in the UK in January and February, and then we obviously saw a marked slowdown between March and May. And to give you the sort of broad strokes of quantums, January and February saw about double the amount of funding activity by value in 2020 versus 2019. And then March through May saw about half the value versus 2019. So from a very strong upward trajectory pre-COVID to a very strong downward trajectory post-COVID. There's a couple of interesting narratives. So there was a discussion, as we're going into this crisis, where is money going to go? Is it going to go early, reflecting these companies have product tech risk? Is it going to go late, reflecting there's more certainty, the business models are established? Or is it going to stay in the middle, where actually the capital markets are a little bit more efficient? There's more funders, seed investors can go a bit later, late stage investors can come a bit earlier. My original hypothesis was that you would see a lot of funding congregate around seed, reflecting that these businesses have very low beta to the overall market, i.e. when the market moves, these companies don't do much because they're still building their product, they're building their technology. And that's what you saw in 2008, actually, is that happening. And that's largely not happened. That's largely not happened until seed funding institutional seed funding has largely slowed down, as has the top end of the range. We have seen less kind of mega rounds, if you will, in the COVID crisis versus the period last year. So that's starting to paint a bit of a picture of sort of overall levels of activity. I thought a couple of interesting perspectives on kind of investor activity. So what are we doing as investors? So if you look at the average number of investors participating in rounds, that has had a dramatic increase. So on average, we are adding one more investor, one more institutional investor to a syndicate per round. So it's gone from a roughly 2 to 3 investors per round pre-COVID to something like 3 to 5, depending on exactly which stage during COVID. So we as investors are looking for more comfort, more security, someone to mark our homework. We're looking for other people to defund the funding risk, representing like we know we need to fund these businesses for at least 18, if not 24 months, if not longer, and we're looking to do that in syndicate rather than independently. Which was one of the narratives we were discussing. Would we see more club deals? Would we not see? Would we not see that? The $1 million question: what's happened to valuations? The data would suggest that valuations have come down. Valuations have come down, and that's not implied by just calculating round size and ownership. Actually, round size has stayed largely the same. Okay, there's a bit of flexibility. And why do we think that is? Well, as I've just said, like we know we need to fund these businesses for longer. We know that we want more security in the business. So round size has not dramatically decreased. So I think that's starting to highlight some of the activities that we as investors have undertaken. In terms of sort of sector, or at least business model, a very strong hypothesis you could have led with was, well, obviously B2C funding is going to stop, right? Representing, largely a huge drop in consumer demand. But actually that's not materialized. That's not markedly different during COVID or pre-COVID, or even relative to the profile of investment that we saw in 2019. Now, again, you may argue actually we're still early in the funding period. This all reflects deals that were in negotiation pre-COVID, but actually, maybe we're starting to see some emergence of some trends. So just a few stats and at least directional insight into what the overall market has been doing, kind of our activity as investors, that I thought at least the audience would find interesting.
No, we've already had a question straight in on that, and it was speaking to your B2C comments there around re or de-evaluations of fintechs like Monzo. after all the pains that's going through. So it sounds like for some of them that may be coming.
Yeah, so there's lots of questions on what's getting funded, what's not getting funded. I mean, as Mina suggested earlier on, like when you talk about value proposition, very hard ROI metrics are going to be really appealing. And so a kind of extension or corollary to that thinking is, the growth model that is acquire users now, monetize later, would probably likely to be less sympathetic to that. So unless you can really point to a strong path to profitability, you're likely to see pressure on valuations. A hypothesis, you're starting to see a few data points that support that, but I think that would be the direction of travel.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. So, I mean, you've literally teed us up onto the category question nicely. So, Caroline, from your perspective and your sort of bird's eye view of what government, corporates, industry, what everyone is doing, what are the categories that are still drawing all the right attention and investment, and which maybe are struggling to do so?
I think it's stepped a bit back from those pure categories, but also throw some facts out. Like Jay, I think Jay, the most interesting thing you said on that was the round size and the types, the variance in that round to diversify that risk is really interesting. We've heard this whole time. So let's be clear. Before COVID, there was a move that valuations may correct a bit anyway. So that was the environment we were in before this kicked off. But what I've heard over this time is just the flight to quality will continue. So looking at the numbers thus far this year so we've seen the largest deals were Revolut, Sterling Bank, Currency Cloud, Onfido, and Thought Machine in the UK. And we had 55 of those deals with foreign investors in them. So around 38% of the total had at least one foreign investor involved. I think we have to at some point acknowledge the foreign money coming to the UK and what that will look like, to your point, Mina, earlier on when we stop moving or can't move, or it's a hybrid model of how much we can move. The other piece I think is really important to look at is how much of the money that we've seen thus far has been follow-on rounds to your existing portfolio versus new rounds. So Mina, your behavior you described at the very beginning, I think is indicative of what we'll see across the board, which is you don't have that pipeline. And so how do you actually continue to build that in this hybrid model? And what does that look like? And will people be more local? So I think when you ask on the government, how the government can support on this, how it's private-public partnerships around that, I think you look to the Amazon halfway through, of course. I think you
need to get that. We can go for a question from the audience quickly.
Do that for a second.
Okay, super. Because it's on what you were talking about, right? And Chris Park has just asked quite a nice question, which is fairly tactical, right? Do VC investors like rounds mixed with corporate ventures and other niche funds? Maybe just a quick rapid fire on how you guys feel about that. Mina, maybe you can just open this up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not really. I guess it's kind of up to the founders to define who they actually want in their investor base. We very much take an approach of, do we actually want to be investors in this company? Do we believe in this founder? Do we believe in what they're doing? And then we will obviously advise and provide our perspective on what we think makes sense for them in terms of how they construct their round. But it's very much kind of their prerogative to say that. Having said that, we invest a lot in enterprise kind of solutions that sell to big banks. So from that perspective, it's actually sometimes extremely helpful to have one of the big institutional corporate VC funds come together and back the company as a strategic user as well. So it can be very beneficial.
Super. Well, Caroline, sorry,
No, sorry about that. Very digital world.
Amazon interrupting fintech. I knew it would happen.
How dare it? I would just say the follow-on piece that I don't want to leave off the table is just that patient capital, growth capital mentality through this whole phase. And the UK has been really strong in earlier stage investment always. Kind of that's our USP in the investment market. We don't have the bigger check size locally to date, but if you don't have people, I'm simplifying, but if less people are jumping on a plane that want to write bigger checks, it's hard to develop that relationship with people over Zoom. Now, I'm not saying it's not possible, but it'll be an evolution as the industry learns how to do that. I was hearing from a late stage investor earlier in COVID saying, we meet with entire management teams for 2 years running before we write these size checks. We're not doing that over Zoom. So unless you had those existing relationships before, and I understand some people are actually drawing upon warm relationships that they never closed on, but they know the folks. So it's all about relationships from what I can hear. So from the industry body's perspective, we're really looking at how we can continue to foster those relationships, champion the industry globally, and tell their story for them so that we can create it. Will everybody connect digitally going forward? Maybe. I welcome the investor's point of view on that, actually.
I might add just one other thought on the previous question, which is around sort of round syndicates and makeup. Exactly, again, to Mina's point, it's it's generally not up to us as investors. It's really the management team. But if you put financial investors in one box, if it's another investor type, really, I think management need to be asking what value specifically is that investor bringing to the round. Can they bring customers? Can they bring expertise? Can they bring other strategic benefits? And if there's valid reasons for and needs for those additional capabilities, then absolutely, I'd imagine we would welcome that to either the board or to the round structure. Certainly.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think from the perspective of corporate VC, I think it's very valuable to have that in rounds. It's in certain cases, sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. I think it depends case by case. We're very open to it, and I think they can add tremendous value. Usually very early on probably makes less sense, and later on, in later rounds, it makes more sense. And then you just got to use common sense and think about it from sort of case by case basis. If your two biggest customers are Pepsi and Coca-Cola, and you take an investment from Pepsi, maybe Coca-Cola may not like it. I mean, those are obvious examples. But I mean, by and large, we have very strong dialogues with corporate VCs, and we think they're very valuable, and in many cases orthogonal to kind of what we do as well.
I'll just add on really quickly to that, just from an institutional perspective in our membership. Many of them, I think I noted this earlier, it's an accelerated sales cycle. So be it direct investment teams, CVCs, et cetera, but if you're selling into it, it's an accelerated. The demand is higher from an institutional perspective and higher than ever. So I think that's back to the optimist, Will, that you are. That's the silver lining in this, which is my favorite joke that I've done on all of these is what created your digital strategy, your CEO, your CTO, or COVID? And so I think it's actually played to the hands of fintechs who are ready to go partner up, be it through investment or otherwise.
Yeah.
Very cool. Thanks for shining light on my day.
Yeah. And Will, I mean, in terms of how to adapt to future investors, we were talking about that earlier, right? It's a different world. How do you pitch on a company? How should I pitch differently? What should I do? What do investors want to see now? I think, as we said before, I think Jay said it, it's, you want to be showing that you're not succeeding because of COVID, but in spite of it. So I think a lot of the founders, a lot of the companies in the ecosystem a year ago, right, neither the founder nor the company in many cases had been through a real recession, right? We had one of the longest lasting business cycles in history. We all knew it would end at some point. And especially if you're doing lending or if you're doing a lot of things in fintech, they're quite cyclical businesses, and you want to be able to show that you can last sort of through the business cycle. So I think a big key to that is unit economics, having discipline on unit economics and understanding what works and doesn't work with your product. These are all things we touched upon earlier. I'll add one final point to that, which is kind of what's impressed us a lot during these times, and we've been continuing to invest at a pretty fast pace, actually, is people that are very intellectually honest and know that something has gone wrong in some cases with the business and are taking steps to address that, but can also articulate what went wrong and why in very clear terms. Because optimism is there for all of us in this industry, but I think if it's sort of blind optimism, that's also counterproductive. You want to sort of have this, look it straight in the eye and be like, well, this did not work, we're changing, and here's why it didn't work, here's what we're doing, and almost using this science-based approach to address those issues.
So really the numbers have got to be way, way tighter, those unit economics. We actually just had quite an interesting question around the B2C funding moving more towards that ROI question and rather less on the growth at all costs point, which I think speaks to that exactly right. It's about truly representing exactly the value and the outcomes earlier, which is probably quite worrying for a number of companies who have grown at all costs, right? Maybe the Uber model won't work anymore. But I mean, Mina, you rightly championed the Brighter acquisition, which is obviously end-to-end remote, so huge respect for that. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about remote funding. Is it here to stay? Is it an uncomfortable compromise that you need to make to get to work with great businesses? What's the, looking back on balance, what's the view at Dawn and yourself?
So I really hope that we are not in for a super protracted period of this end-to-end digital fundraising. It's extremely uncomfortable. Specifically in the case of Brighter, this was a space where we just had spent so much time in it. We know Excel very well. There was a lot of kind of pre-cooked, I suppose, conviction and knowledge and knowledge of the space and knowledge of the partners and a lot of time spent with the founders to get to know them as well. But it's definitely not the preferred way of working. And also, I think I very much echo what Caroline and I think maybe Jay also referred to earlier, that a lot of what's happened in the last couple of months has been built on social capital that was built up in person, long-standing relationships that you've just nurtured over time. And at some point, this is going to deplete, right? I mean, this is just, I think it's very difficult to, especially when you now can have those local relationships being nurtured in person. I think the remote thing is highly uncomfortable. I'm also itching to get back to Stockholm and Copenhagen, so and Helsinki, because it is just the nature of what we do, and it's not just deciding whether to invest in a company. What actually we haven't spent much time thinking about, but I think it's equally important, is I actually funded a company in March, and then I just couldn't see them anymore. And that's actually even worse because, you've built up this relationship. Now you actually have to get into the marriage, right? Like the getting married part was sort of easy. Now you kind of have to go and do the work and really get under the hood of the company and have these strategic discussions and the heavy lifting of where we headed, especially in this environment. And that was really uncomfortable, actually, having these very intense discussions, very deep problem solving, completely, also we have like part of the team in San Francisco, so it was just, so I for one hope that that's not the new way. I think we've all kind of figured out a way to move forward and keep doing and keep getting the work done as much as possible. But I do think that, at least from my perspective, as soon as I can go and actually be with my companies in person and with founders in person, I'll do that at the first opportunity. But very curious to hear what this group thinks about this.
Yeah, I mean, I'd fully support that. I mean, I was always, historically an advocate for doing things remotely, but the reality is that the thought of writing someone a check for 5, 10, 50, 100 million pounds is very uncomfortable, having never met them, having never been into this premises, seen how they interact with you face to face, see how they interact with the team, their direct reports. That's a key part of the investment process, and that is very difficult to do over Zoom, Teams, whatever you're using. I mean, largely a lot of the rest of the investment process can be done more efficiently. The flow of information, be back-to-back meetings, like you can do that much more efficiently. But actually, a huge part of most of our investment processes will be to understand the management team at quite a deep level, and that is just materially harder to do remotely.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of studies that some people shared with me around why is Zoom more exhausting, and I think it turns out it's because your brain is working harder to adjust to these clues from people's expressions and hand gestures that normally you get easier if you're like in person, but over the camera it's that much harder to read people's emotions and intentions. And so much of investing is building a relationship and reading someone's motivation, how they would react in challenging circumstances, what are they like, how will we get along, how will we handle conflict, success, failure, etc. And trying to do that over a video for the first time is more difficult for sure. So I think people interactions will come back. It's a question of time. I don't think we'll be stuck in a world of Zoom for the next several years. At least I hope not. But that's my view.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to play devil's advocate on this, which is we don't have to get on planes anymore. So does it actually open up a more global audience for investment? And I think while it's not a hybrid world, and while we are all in digital jail or whatever you want to call it, does that start to open up opportunities and have you looked a little bit differently because of that? And then the next step is, I'd be curious for the investors in the room, are you developing relationships now with the thought that you can invest when we can all meet each other again? So is it a good time for fintechs to approach you, be in touch with you, etc.? Because as we come out of this, you'll have done the hard initial work, and then you can go a bit further.
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer briefly. Our pipeline is very active, and we have no rule that says we would not invest if we haven't met in person. So we don't tend to make rules about those things. It is just an extra challenge, but we've done deals in challenging situations before. But yeah, we're definitely building relationships, definitely talking to companies for the first time, meeting people, networking. So we're very much doing all that, just in a slightly different circumstance.
In terms of investment activity, yeah, exactly the same as Yusuf. Still meeting companies, still have capital to invest, still excited to make investments, work with startups, work with founders. To the other part of your question, Caroline, the international versus domestic funding question. Well, I think it really depends on stage quite significantly. Earlier stage is predominantly a local game. Later stage is predominantly an international game, and I think you'll see that more play out, as we progress.
So that's interesting, and probably teases us up nicely for our first guest, who I've invited in, Rajesh, who was asking specifically about overseas investment. And maybe Rajesh, if I could just ask you to, one tweak is, instead of focusing on a specific region, maybe position it in emerging markets rather than specifically Africa, which you'd highlighted.
Sorry, Will, you're just breaking up. I caught the last part of what you said. Apologies.
I was just asking a favor that you might frame your question through the lens of emerging markets rather than just specifically the Africa continent.
Oh, absolutely. And obviously, many thanks for giving me an opportunity to speak. Yeah, I mean, my interest very much is focusing on personal experiences for running. My question really for those investors out here at the moment is more about what are your activities in the current climate, especially for those focusing on whether it's remittances or whether it's other sort of fintech orientated products. It'd be good to get your feedback on that, because sitting here in London, having partners spread out across specifically in Africa, it's actually a good time to understand what VCs are doing. And really, I guess this is a question looking forward into the next few months, regardless of what COVID brings or doesn't bring. And that's open to the panel.
Quick answer on that, because we're actually just in a discussion at this at QED over the last few weeks, and we've actively now chosen to actually expand very fast and put some resources into going into the rest of the world. So we're thinking of that. So we have strong LATAM presence, strong US, Canada, and pretty strong UK and North Europe presence. But we're now seeing India, huge market. So we're going to lean into that. East Asia, I mean, enough said. Obviously, that is close to 1/3, if not more, of the world economy. So we'll actually put a lot of resources into what we sort of probably mistakenly call rest of the world, and could be a bigger part of QED, 5-10 years from now than it is today.
It might just be, I mean, from our perspective, we invest exclusively in UK businesses, and that's largely reflective of the structure of our funds more than investment appetite. But as a result, we won't invest outside of the UK. So probably not for us, certainly.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't comment because we are only European focused, and I suppose we have looked at things, maybe Turkey, kind of. That's how far Europe has extended for us historically. So no, and we don't plan on changing that. It's a very clearly defined mandate that we have with our investors to be European focused.
Okay.
I'll just add to that, which is just in terms of opportunity there, be it in this room or otherwise. But my comment earlier, which is there's a huge demand for financial services to be digital first. So globally, that will have only accelerated. So be it coming from the UK or otherwise, I do think it will, across every industry, as we've been seeing, if you weren't digital first before COVID, you need to accelerate to be that during COVID, and that hopefully will go on into the future. So we're seeing emerging markets develop in fintech ecosystems very quickly. Things like open banking, where you can kind of jump forward based on some of the work that's been done globally, is helping that. But somebody mentioned Southeast Asia, even the likes of Japan, Thailand, etc. There's a lot of digital engagement coming out of that. So it's a great place for the UK companies to scale too. It's a great place to seek investment from. And so I think as an industry, we're looking at those options.
And one anecdote I wanted to share on that, because we literally just talked about it last week. In the early days of QED, 12 years ago, I guess it was very US focused at the time, even though there were some exceptions clearly. And then I guess it was 7 years ago, sort of this opportunity in Brazil came along, and the team at the time was quite reluctant to invest. And the Brazilian market seemed very exotic, I suppose, from the US perspective and all this. And then the team ended up doing that investment, which turned out to be Nubank 7 years ago. And on the back of that investment, now we've built a very strong franchise in LATAM. So I think it pays off to be open-minded, whether it's Africa or anywhere else in the world, Turkey, etc. And I do think there's great opportunities. But as Jay and Nina said, I mean, you have limited resources. So that's what we sort of always struggle with. You don't want to dabble in the market. If you do it, you want to build a network, do it properly, get positive selection, which is not easy, obviously.
Super.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much. Definitely not easy. I think I've been doing business in Africa for many years, so had the experience of going the long route, and I can definitely see that more and more funding has come into that sector or into the continent over the last year. But I think from a founder's perspective, at least, we've managed to raise capital internally through shareholders, talking to VCs and meeting them now. Myself ready to actually scale the business, but it's certainly interesting to get people's points of view, because I tend to be not in just this room, but actually you as a founder, you get locked away in your own mind and perhaps don't get a chance to connect with the right people, even if you're in London or abroad. So it's certainly a great opportunity to speak and hear other people's points of view. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question, Rajesh. We'll catch you up in breakouts and hopefully in the networking.
Thank you.
Awesome. So we do have a live audience. So coming back to the thoughts on remote, inevitably it's going to be something we're going to have to overcome in the next weeks and probably months. And if there's a second peak, we'll still be coming back to it. I mean, super tactically, we've clearly got founders on listening in. If I ask each of you for one tactical tip that a founder or a senior member of the team who's going to be leading that first discussion should do in preparation or during that first call with an investor or a venture firm, what would be your top tip? right? So I'll quickly run through Mina. Maybe you can just give a top tactical tip.
Are you asking specifically for when you're doing this remotely?
Exactly.
Yeah? Okay. Well, I guess it's a little bit related to what we've discussed about. You know, it's very difficult to read kind of body language, to read people's cues. So and you also just come across as way more flat when you're on a screen, right? Just by definition. So I guess just tactically, you know, just being very, very high energy and extra clear with what you're trying to convey to your audience becomes even more important. And I would say what I've noticed if you're bringing like more of you on screen, more of your team, what really doesn't work on Zoom is if you haven't really thought about how you're going to orchestrate that, because it just gets this awkward, like, you speak now and you speak. So you really just think about how you're going to orchestrate your meeting, whose role it is to say what, and just really have a real flow that feels really forced. Like we've had to do this with my team at Dawn, and it just feels really forced and uncomfortable the few times you do it. And then it's like, how did we ever do this otherwise? But yeah, it just forces you to be way more structured and way more clear in what you're trying to convey in the short time that you'll have.
Okay, so concise, clear, and good, and have that structure. The answer structure is definitely a tactical move. And Caroline, what would yours be?
I may cheat and be a little less tactical on it, but I do think, to my point earlier, which is to have the conversations, to set them up, to build that pipeline with the audiences that you want to chat to in person to go forward. It's not as tactical, but I think it's important that you almost treat this. It's from an industry body, programmatically connecting people. Just this example of today is a perfect example, which is it's very possible, much of what we can do can be done digitally, and use that and optimize it.
Love that. So Yusuf, and then maybe Jay, just to wrap us up.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious one is have good hardware and good infrastructure. So make sure your internet connection is good. Invest in a good camera. I'll mention that a bit later, but I mean, they're all sold out, by the way, the best one. And have good equipment, one. And then two is, I mean, the medium that you may be presenting in. If it's not perfect for you, maybe try to negotiate to do it on Zoom. So if you really don't like Blue Jeans and that's what they're using, and you really prefer Zoom, or you don't like Microsoft Teams, or you happen to prefer this, whatever, Google Hangouts or whatever it is, ask to do it in the medium you feel more comfortable, because you're the one presenting. And you know, so that's one thing. Certainly rehearse with your partner as well, and your co-founders, and then try to manage the Q&A bits as well as you can, maybe via chats, so it's just overcome all these awkward moments that can happen.
And Jay, what about you?
Yeah, you know, I'd support the sort of 2 points Mina and Yusuf said, which is so number one, you know, if you're the CEO, it is your role to orchestrate this meeting, draw on the members of your team for their representative parts of the presentation, be it the CFO for the financials or CMO for marketing, whatever it may be. But it is very much your role to orchestrate this meeting and overdo that in the context of Zoom or Teams or whatever. On the sort of hardware software point, know how it works. You know you're going to have to share a screen at some point. Make sure you know how to do that so you don't waste 5 minutes going, okay, which button do I press where? Is it on here? So someone help me. We're 3 months into this now. You should have that figured out. I mean, so to know how to use it. And then the final point I would add is overcompensate with the preparation of the materials and the data. Have that well structured in, you know, be it an official data room or at least a Dropbox, but make the provision and frequency of data better than you would have otherwise done. Because representing, you've got some way to go to make up the barrier that we now have. To just be more forthcoming, more willing to share data earlier in the process. That will help build confidence sooner.
Love that. So structure your answers, try and be super concise, but keep the energy levels high. Yusuf, invest in the infrastructure, hardware, tools, make sure that everything works. And Jay, have your data room in real order so that so that all of the available information is very much a click away. That's super handy. I'm conscious we're heading into the last few minutes, and we'd actually planned to chat about so many other things, but we've had some good audience interaction, so I think it's a fair trade. But I guess the one that I'd love to ask, because I know there's a bit of additional insight and data here, is actually to Yusuf, particularly around businesses who are adapting their operations. I think this will be super relevant to the audience. You know, how are leaders adapting their operation, and what's working within, you know, your CEO, your portfolio, your lens that you look through?
Yeah. I mean, we had a very good group discussion with our CEOs from our portfolio companies, and we talked about working remotely and what works and what doesn't work. And so what I mentioned before, hardware, software was the first one. I was guilty of this myself. I worked off of my laptop for actually 3 weeks, and, you know, I think my eyesight suffered as a result. So go to your team and make sure everybody has a good screen, good monitor, good keyboard. And like I said, best ones are sold out. My favorite keyboard was only available in German version, so I had the German umlaut keyboard now. So, you know, but still do it, right? The other thing is get the right kind of team, both in terms of people like working, the actual teammates and all that, and also the managers, right? Managing people in these circumstances is very different from managing someone normally. And, you know, people may show up and have real like mental health issues, which is a big theme for QED. We know that mental health is a serious problem in the best of times, and in these times it's very hard to see like who hasn't slept well, who is not feeling well, who may be going down a darker path and not sharing that with the team. So managing that, your managers in your team and you yourself as a founder, it's going to be critical to really watch out for that, right? The other really interesting insight that's coming out of our portfolio companies is you may be living in a world which is remote first after this, and a lot of them have gone remote first, in which case you actually pay less money on your rent, and you may have a bigger budget left and use that budget to do more team building. So if you live in a world where only 20% of the team is in the office at any given point, once a month you can now afford, hopefully, to do a better offsite, go to someplace, maybe outdoors ideally, right, where you can in a safe way interact with the team and do a team building. I'm saying obviously when the guidelines allow for that. So that's been a lot of the thinking that's been coming out of those things. And the final one that's come out of it is time off. Like somebody coined the term Blur's Day, and you know, it is, you know, you find yourself working on a Saturday and it doesn't feel like the weekend. Well, Monday doesn't feel like a Monday, so it's just all a bit confusing. Force yourself and your teammates to take a day off, whichever format that takes, or a week off.
And I guess what I would find interesting, and guys, there's something that's more interesting, but is with the major theme you were talking about there, which is mental health. And I think that's probably the biggest, for me, awareness that I've had, or awakening in this process. You know, we were talking about doing this, but what are your favorite tactics, or what are you seeing that teams are doing that's interesting in relation to people, keeping people engaged, motivated, and obviously mentally well? Nina, maybe I can ask you to take that one first.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this has been very, very high on our minds with our own team at Dawn. Even though we are quite small, so we know each other quite well, but still, you just don't know how people react to massively extraordinary new ways of living. And then for our companies as well. I mean, look, there's lots of things to say, but I think my favorite thing that just stuck with me was that in a few of our companies, basically the executive team agreed that they're going to have a rotation where every one of them for at least kind of 45 minutes per day just spends the time like calling a random employee of the company and just spends the time kind of getting feedback, just a one-on-one session to get feedback, to kind of talk about where the company is headed. Some of the ones where we've had, you know, a difficult transition, you know, people going in with like 3-4x budgets, having to redo their budgets. It's been a lot of just being there for people and making it kind of very accessible, because I think communication right now has been very tough. You can't really bump into the CEO anymore. and ask him a question or her a question. So that's been quite effective, and just a nice way of having individual attention to your employees.
Caroline, from your lens, what are you seeing?
I think it's so important. So at the very beginning of this, we actually appointed a woman on our team to be the new CFO, which was this chief fun officer. So we injected it initially. We had quiz days on Wednesdays. We had drinks on Friday over Zoom. So you set that precedent, and I think it's the re-engaging regularly and iterating regularly. Because like we said, we didn't know how long this would last at the beginning. And I think a lot of us went through, there's probably a better phrase for it, but we all worked through it as therapy. If you worked hard, you could control something throughout all of this going on. And there's a burnout factor to that. And people are dealing with lots of different things simultaneously. So they're homeschooling, myself included. You're having Amazon deliveries halfway through. We're all more human by proxy. So I find that the positive is every call starts with actually connecting with human beings, no matter how serious the tone of the call is. So how are you? And it's people you've never met before to some extent. I think in business practice, we're becoming slightly more human by proxy, or I hope that continues. It's regular check-ins, ensuring, as Mina said, you manage differently during these times. If you're a 20-person company, probably a bit easier. But if you're brand new to a startup that's 300 people and you don't have that social power even internally to get stuff done, you need to create infrastructure internally to allow for that. The positive is, I think, particularly on our team, you're getting better cross-pollination of people and you're communicating more regularly. So WhatsApp on management teams, you have access to the CEO all the time by proxy, where you would have to have that face-to-face time. So I do think it's just changing behaviors and adapting and iterating and making sure you're not getting stuck in a certain way where there's some blind spots.
I guess I'll just finish off just highlighting a sort of minor point, Caroline, which, as managers, you got to acknowledge that personal circumstances are going to be different, and that's absolutely okay. Be it ways of working, be it childcare, be it times of working, ways of communicating. Like, these have all changed, and that's cool. That's just going to be how it's going to work for a while. And if you've got to do half a day homeschooling and then you need to work, at 9 o'clock at night, that's just going to have to be how it works for the time being, and that's fine. Sort of removing that level of anxiety for people as managers is really, really important. And will continue to be so.
Awesome. Well, we've used up all of our time, and I found it super interesting hearing from different perspectives. Is there any closing comments or anything else that anyone would like to add before we wrap it up?
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah, well done.
No, pleasure. Thank you. It's all in the guests. Have a wonderful week, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the event.